The Zerati hive had never known silence, yet on this day the corridors throbbed with an unnatural hush. The great domes of their capital, usually alive with the pulsing chants of warriors and the screeches of hatchlings, carried only the tremor of restrained fear. Word spread faster than light across their territories. The daughters of Queen Sheraketh were gone. Not stolen from a battlefield, nor lost in the cold void of space, but vanished from within the fortified heart of the hive itself, a sanctum guarded by legions sworn to tear apart intruders. For the Zerati, lineage was not a tender matter but the pillar of power. The queen's daughters were more than heirs, they were future conduits of the hive's continuity. Their disappearance was no minor offense, but a wound that threatened to shatter the empire's cohesion. Whispers ran through the hive's ranks that whoever dared such an act had declared war not only on Sheraketh, but on the very principle of Zerati dominance. The queen herself was a creature of brutal grace, towering above her kind, carapace gleaming like molten steel. She had led armies against rival empires, had watched stars burn in the wake of her fleets, and she had never tasted defeat. Now her rage filled the hive like a storm, and with every passing hour her patience thinned. The galaxy trembled at her fury. Threats poured from her throne chamber, and emissaries of neighboring powers scrambled to deny involvement. Yet in her venom-laced speeches, one accusation rose above all others: suspicion of the Terrans. Humans were the unpredictable newcomers in galactic politics. Small in number, scattered across fragile colonies, they lacked the sheer mass of other empires. Yet their survival in hostile environments baffled seasoned species. They were too adaptive, too stubborn to yield, and this anomaly of behavior inspired both fascination and unease. To Sheraketh, the disappearance of her daughters bore the mark of something reckless, something that bent the rules of galactic expectation. It smelled human. Far from the hive's throne, Captain Elias Ward sat at the edge of a cold observation deck, staring through reinforced glass at the jagged planet below. His uniform bore the scars of many campaigns, patched fabric, faded insignia, and the permanent stiffness of a man who had carried his weight through more battles than he cared to count. Unlike the Zerati, his reputation was not carved in conquest but in survival. He had fought on collapsed front lines, commanded men who never returned, and endured the hollow silence after each victory claimed too much. Those experiences had etched lines into his face, but there was still a steadiness in his gaze, a refusal to be broken. The news of the princess's disappearance reached him like a ripple carried through comm channels, distorted by fear. Elias listened, impassive at first, until he realized how quickly the blame circled toward humanity. In the eyes of the hive, logic was secondary to instinct, and the instinct of predators was to lash out. A war sparked by suspicion alone would be catastrophic. Humans had barely carved a place for themselves among the stars. Now, through no fault of their own, they might be hunted into extinction. He leaned back in his chair, his hand resting against a scar across his ribs, the reminder of a conflict fought long before the hive's shadow loomed over his world. He thought of the whispers that the Zerati princesses were more beast than child, their alien forms too strange for human empathy. Yet the words missing daughters pierced him deeper than any tactical briefing. To him, they were not symbols or assets. They were simply children, vulnerable and terrified somewhere in the void, and no political calculus could make their plight irrelevant. Elias rose and crossed the deck to where his second-in-command waited. The younger officer's voice quivered as he spoke of mobilizing defenses, of preparing for inevitable retaliation. Elias shook his head. "You don't prepare for a storm by hiding under the table," he said. "You go out and see which way the wind's blowing." He submitted a request to investigate personally, not as a soldier but as a man unwilling to let fear dictate the truth. The response from the hive was swift and heavy-handed. Within hours, a delegation of armored warriors arrived at the outpost, their exoskeletal frames gleaming, their every movement vibrating with aggression. The outpost's crew stiffened at their arrival, hands twitching near sidearms, but Elias held them steady with a single glance. The Zerati leader announced that the queen demanded his presence. Rumors had already reached her that strange energy readings had been traced near the human quarters. To her, it was enough to summon him into her jaws. Escorted between towering guards, Elias felt the shift in the air as the ship's engines roared and set course for the hive world. He walked without resistance, though every instinct warned him he might not return. Yet resignation was not in his nature. He had made a choice, to step forward into the Queen's fury rather than wait for it to fall upon humanity unopposed. The hive world loomed large as they descended, a vast scarred planet veined with rivers of glowing magma and cloaked in colossal hive structures that reached into the clouds. From orbit, it resembled a living wound, pulsing with the restless energy of countless warriors. As the transport plunged through the atmosphere, the ship shuddered with turbulence, but Elias stood firm, unshaken by the turbulence or the hostile eyes fixed on him. When the gates of the throne chamber opened, the scale of Sheraketh's dominion revealed itself. Vast pillars carved from the bones of extinct leviathans reached upward, and the queen sat upon a dais of obsidian, her massive frame coiled in restrained menace. Her eyes glowed with predatory light as she fixed them upon the lone human walking into her domain. The chamber echoed with the hiss of her warriors, every sound carrying a promise of violence. Elias felt their gaze pressing down on him, the weight of an empire's hatred resting squarely on his shoulders. Yet he neither bowed nor faltered. He stopped at the foot of the dais, his voice steady as he addressed the queen. "If I had your daughters, they would not be missing. They would be safe." The chamber erupted in a cacophony of rage, warriors raising weapons, claws scraping against the stone floor. Sheraketh raised a hand, silencing them, though her eyes narrowed with unmasked fury. In that moment, the silence of the hive returned, deeper and heavier than before. Elias held her gaze, unblinking, knowing the next breath might determine whether humanity lived or died. The chamber's silence was broken only by the sharp intake of breath from the warriors lining the walls. No one had ever spoken to Sheraketh in such a manner and lived to recount it. Her claws flexed, scraping shallow furrows into the black stone of her dais, but her eyes did not leave Elias. For a moment, it seemed she might strike him down where he stood, yet instead she leaned forward, her voice carrying the weight of a storm. "You claim safety, human, yet my daughters are gone. The walls of my hive were built with rivers of blood, and no creature has crossed them unpunished. Tell me, why should I not peel the truth from your flesh and scatter your bones across the void?" Elias stood unmoving, his voice calm though every sense warned him of the danger. "Because truth does not come from torture. And because if I had them, they would cling to me as if they had no other refuge. Children know when they are safe." The words were reckless in their simplicity, yet they rang through the chamber like the toll of a bell. The hive lived by dominance, by fear and submission, and here stood a man who neither groveled nor threatened, but spoke as though his will was an equal force. A murmur ran through the assembled warriors, half outrage, half bewilderment. The queen regarded him for a long, taut silence, then motioned sharply with one claw. "Prove your innocence. If you are lying, I will know. If you speak truth, the hive itself will reveal it." He was escorted from the chamber by 2 guards, their armor clicking as they marched him through the labyrinthine corridors of the hive. The walls pulsed faintly with the hive's living architecture, each chamber humid with the scent of resin and molten stone. Though the guards towered over him, Elias walked with unhurried steps, his thoughts steady. Every instinct told him that the daughters were near, though he could not explain how he knew. The investigation began formally, with scanners, interrogations, and the scrutiny of hundreds of eyes watching his every movement. He endured each without resistance, answering their questions with the measured composure of a man who had nothing to conceal. Yet all the while, he noticed subtle signs, tiny thermal traces along the edges of his path, faint residual pheromones that clung like whispers in the air. Where others saw emptiness, he sensed a pattern. Hours bled together as he followed the trail deeper into the hive, ignoring the derision of his escort. What could a human possibly discern in the depths of their domain? Yet he pressed on, guided less by logic than by instinct, until at last he reached the outer section reserved for Terran envoys. His quarters were dark when the door slid open, the air cooler than the rest of the hive. Elias crossed the threshold and stopped, struck by a silence far heavier than any he had felt before. The guards fanned out behind him, weapons drawn, their carapaces humming with suspicion. He moved toward the bed with deliberate steps, and as the dim light flickered on, the truth revealed itself. There, curled against his chest as he lay slumped in an unintended sleep, were the queen's daughters. Their bodies were smaller than the towering warriors, their exoskeletons still soft with youth, their limbs folded tightly as they clung to him. Their eyes, slitted and bright, blinked open at the disturbance, and when the guards raised their weapons, the younglings hissed and pressed themselves harder against him. Elias awoke fully to the chaos, blinking once before wrapping his arms instinctively around the two creatures nestled against him. He did not recoil at their alien forms, nor flinch at their defensive hisses. Instead, he tightened his hold, his voice low and steady. "Easy. You're safe." The chamber erupted in fury. Guards surged forward, only to halt as the daughters bared their teeth, their bodies coiling around him with surprising strength. Their tiny claws dug into his uniform as though anchoring themselves against the world. Every attempt to separate them only worsened their cries, filling the room with a piercing resonance that set even the hardened warriors on edge. One of the guards snarled, his voice carrying over the comm, "He has bewitched them. The queen will end him." But Elias ignored them, his focus locked on the trembling forms in his arms. He could feel their fear, their desperate need for protection. There was no deception here, no clever trick or hidden scheme. They had come to him willingly, perhaps because in his stillness, in his refusal to exude dominance, they had found something unfamiliar to the hive: gentleness. Moments later, the chamber doors split open and Sheraketh entered, her presence vast and overwhelming. The guards dropped to their knees, claws pressed to the floor, but Elias remained seated on the bed, his arms still around the daughters. The queen's eyes blazed as she took in the sight, and for the first time in her reign, uncertainty touched her features. Her daughters turned toward her, but instead of rushing into her arms, they pressed closer to Elias, their bodies trembling with the instinct to stay hidden. Sheraketh's fury was palpable, her claws slicing faint arcs into the air. "What sorcery is this?" she thundered. Elias met her gaze, his voice unyielding. "No sorcery. They came to me because they were afraid. I didn't seek them, but I won't abandon them either." The words landed with the weight of a challenge, though they were spoken with calm conviction. Around them, the warriors shifted uneasily, caught between the queen's wrath and the undeniable proof of their princess's choice. Sheraketh's breath came in low growls, her massive frame tense with the urge to strike, yet she did not. Instead, she drew closer, lowering her immense head until her eyes were level with his. For a heartbeat, the air itself seemed to stop, every sound fading beneath the crackling intensity of the moment. "If you have truly gained their trust," she said, her voice quieter but laced with danger, "then you will keep it, even in the depths of the hive. If you have deceived us, you will beg for death before I grant it." The guards moved to surround him once more, but this time, they did not attempt to wrench the daughters away. Instead, the queen gestured for Elias to rise, her daughters still clinging to his chest. As he followed her out of the chamber and into the abyssal corridors of the hive, Elias knew there was no turning back. Whatever trial awaited him beneath the surface, it would decide not only his fate but the fragile balance between two species. The hive's underchambers were not built for outsiders. The air thickened as Elias was escorted deeper, the resin-lined tunnels glowing with dim, organic light. The walls pulsed faintly, alive with the steady heartbeat of millions who lived and moved above. Warriors flanked him on all sides, but they kept their distance, as if the children in his arms exuded a force they dared not cross. The princesses clung to him without hesitation, their limbs looped tightly around his shoulders, their small heads buried against his chest. They trembled when the queen's warriors hissed too near, but quieted when Elias whispered softly, his voice steady as stone in the shifting dark. The trial began without ceremony. He was brought into a vast cavern lined with warriors, each one a sentinel of suspicion. The queen watched from a dais carved into the rock, her towering presence illuminated by the crimson glow of molten veins that ran beneath the chamber floor. She announced with a thunderous voice that the human would undergo the hive's judgment. If he was unworthy, he would die before her eyes. If he survived, his survival would mean only that the daughters had chosen him for reasons the hive could not ignore. The first test was designed to break his body. A circle of warriors surrounded him, their movements fast and brutal. Elias knew he could not match their sheer power, yet he refused to yield. He moved with the discipline of years spent fighting enemies far larger than himself, his strikes precise, his footwork efficient. Where strength failed, Endurance carried him. He bled from shallow cuts, his chest burned with exertion, but he did not falter. Each time he staggered, the daughters cried out, their voices sharp and piercing, and at their sound he rose again, unbroken. When at last the queen called the warriors to stand down, Elias stood on shaking legs, his breath harsh but his eyes defiant. The hive had seen resilience, and resilience was something they understood. The second test struck deeper, seeking to unravel his mind. He was confined in darkness, fed with hallucinatory pheromones that warped sound and sight. Shapes shifted before his eyes, voices taunted him with memories of failure, of comrades left behind, of children he could not save in past wars. The hive intended to break him with his own regrets. Yet Elias did not succumb. He sat in the suffocating dark and spoke softly to the daughters who had followed him into the chamber, even when the guards tried to bar them. He told them of earth's skies, of forests where wind moved through branches like whispers, of rivers that sang against stones. The words steadied him, and as the hours stretched into eternity, it was not despair that filled the chamber but the quiet sound of two alien children lulled into calm sleep against his chest. When the test concluded, the queen's gaze sharpened. He had endured what few outsiders could. The hive muttered among themselves, torn between outrage and a growing unease. The daughters had not only chosen him but shielded him, their small bodies pressing between him and harm as though guided by instinct. That bond, though unnatural to Zerati eyes, could not be denied. In the days that followed, Elias remained under the queen's watch, moving through the hive with guards at his heels and the princesses constantly at his side. Slowly, he learned to read their subtle gestures, the flick of antennae that signaled unease, the low trill that meant comfort, the soft hiss that marked affection. They responded to his presence with growing trust, their fear ebbing whenever he was near. He fed them from his own rations, hummed soft tunes when they shivered, and listened when they attempted to mimic his words with their strange, clicking voices. It was in one of those moments of quiet that the truth began to surface. The daughters whispered in broken fragments, their words scattered but sharp. They spoke of shadows within the hive, of strange figures who lurked near their chambers, of whispers that promised safety if they followed but reeked of betrayal. They had fled not out of mischief but from a terror they could not name, and in their flight they had sought refuge in the first presence that did not feel predatory. That presence had been Elias. He pieced together their fragments with the patience of a soldier who had once unraveled enemy codes. It became clear that the threat did not come from outside the hive but from within. The conspiracy was deliberate, a plot to assassinate the daughters and frame humanity for the crime. Such an act would have sparked the war Shereketh now teetered on the brink of declaring. The realization struck with grim clarity: he was not only defending himself, but standing against forces inside the hive determined to plunge the galaxy into fire. When Elias presented what he had discovered, the queen's reaction was a storm contained within her massive frame. She wanted proof, hard and undeniable. Yet his words were difficult to dismiss, for her daughters shrieked in protest when guards attempted to separate them from him, their voices cutting through the chamber with undeniable instinct. They had chosen him, and in Zerati culture, instinct was no trivial thing. The queen's eyes burned as she weighed pride against truth, and for the first time, uncertainty shadowed her expression. Elias understood the gravity of what he had unearthed. To accuse the hive of betrayal was to challenge the very structure of its power. But he also knew hesitation would doom not just himself but every human colony within reach of the queen's fleets. He had no choice but to press forward. The night before his fate was to be decided, he sat in his quarters with the daughters curled against him, their steady breathing the only sound. His body ached from wounds that had not fully healed, his mind throbbed with the weight of responsibility, yet he felt no regret. He had once believed himself hollow, stripped of purpose by wars that had taken too much. Now, with two trembling children trusting him against the fury of an empire, he felt the weight of something greater than survival, duty, fierce and undeniable. The decision came the next day, but not in the form he expected. Alarms shrieked through the hive, and the ground trembled with the force of an explosion. The traitors had chosen their moment. Warriors flooded the chambers, their weapons raised not in defense but in attack, their eyes burning with treachery. The hive itself convulsed in chaos, and the daughters shrieked as the air filled with the stench of war. Elias pulled them close and stood ready. The conspiracy was no longer hidden. It had arrived with fire and claws, and it fell upon him to protect the lives that had chosen him, no matter the cost. The hive convulsed with violence as the traitors struck. The walls shook with detonations, resin cracked from the force of impacts, and the air filled with the stench of scorched chitin. Warriors turned against warriors in a frenzy of confusion, blades clashing, shrieks echoing through the tunnels. Elias had no time to marvel at the chaos. His only thought was the daughters pressed against him, their small bodies trembling, their cries shrill enough to cut through the din. He pulled them close and pressed forward, moving with the urgency of a man who had nothing left to lose but them. The first traitor lunged from the shadows, a towering Zerati armed with a jagged blade. Elias reacted on instinct, sidestepping and driving his elbow into the warrior's throat. The blade sliced across his arm, burning white pain into his flesh, but he did not falter. He tore the weapon from the alien's grip and used it with brutal efficiency, cutting him down before the daughters could scream again. More came. He fought like a man possessed, his movements sharpened by years of training and the desperation of protecting lives that were not his own but had become his to guard. He struck not with fury but with precision, conserving strength where he could, taking blows when avoidance meant exposing the younglings. His blood stained the ground, yet he did not release them. Every cry they made gave him strength, each breath against his chest a reminder of why he stood his ground. The corridors grew narrower, the fighting more intense. Loyalist warriors surged to hold the lines, but the traitors had planned their strike well. Explosions tore through supports, collapsing tunnels, choking the air with smoke and dust. In the chaos, Elias caught sight of figures coordinating the assault, their gestures crisp, their movements deliberate. These were not wild rebels, they were officers of the hive, those who had worn loyalty like armor while plotting betrayal beneath it. Their goal was clear: slay the daughters, let humanity be blamed, and force the queen to unleash her vengeance across the stars. Elias pushed forward, carving a path through the chaos. His lungs burned, his body screamed with pain, but the daughters clung tighter, their small claws digging into him with every jolt. At last he reached a chamber where the battle reached its peak. Sheraketh herself stood at its center, her carapace scorched, her massive claws drenched in blood. She fought with the ferocity of a storm, each strike tearing through traitors like paper, yet even her might was pressed to its limits by the sheer tide of enemies. Her gaze found Elias through the carnage, and for a heartbeat their eyes locked. She saw him battered, drenched in blood, her daughters wrapped around him as though he were their shield. For the first time in her life, hesitation touched her rage. He should have been crushed by the trials, broken by the swarm, yet here he was, holding the most precious beings in her world against a storm meant to erase them. A traitor broke past her defense and lunged toward Elias. Without thought, he turned his body, taking the strike meant for the daughters. The blade sank deep into his side, and pain ripped through him like fire. He gasped but did not fall. With one arm he wrenched the weapon free, with the other he held the children tighter. He struck again, ending his attacker with a guttural cry that silenced the chamber for a heartbeat. The daughters wailed, their bodies glowing faintly with a light that shimmered along their exoskeletons. It was a power Elias did not understand, primal and fierce, radiating in waves that pulsed through the hive. The traitors recoiled, stumbling as though the very air had turned against them. Loyalists rallied to the surge, pressing forward with renewed vigor. The daughters' bond with Elias had awakened something dormant, something that transformed their cries into a force that shook the hive itself. Sheraketh seized the moment. With a roar that shook stone from the ceiling, she cut down the remaining traitors, her strikes fueled by the daughters' strange energy. When the last enemy fell, silence swept the chamber, broken only by Elias' ragged breathing and the soft keening of the princesses. He sank to one knee, his vision blurred, the world tilting around him. Blood poured from his side, his body refusing to obey. The daughters pressed against his chest, their glow flickering as though they were pouring what strength they had into him. He tried to speak, but only a whisper emerged. "Stay safe." The queen moved closer, her massive frame lowering until her shadow enveloped him. She looked down at her daughters, pressed against the human who had bled for them, who had fought beyond reason to shield them. Their glow dimmed as they curled tighter, refusing to leave his arms. Sheraketh reached out with one clawed hand, and for the first time in her reign, she touched another being not in conquest but in acknowledgement. "You have done what no Zerati could," she said, her voice low, resonant with something unfamiliar. "You bled not for victory, not for power, but for my children. For that, I name you kin, protector of the hive." The warriors around her bowed in stunned silence. A title never before given to an outsider now belonged to a human, carved in blood and defiance. Elias tried to rise, but his strength failed. Darkness tugged at the edges of his vision, yet before it claimed him entirely, he felt the daughters' warmth press into him, their voices humming a sound he could not understand but recognized as comfort. When he woke, time had passed. His wounds were bound with strange resin, his body heavy but alive. The daughters lay curled against him still, their eyes closed, their breathing slow. The chamber was quiet, guarded by loyal warriors who now looked upon him not with suspicion but with respect tinged with fear. Sheraketh stood nearby, her presence no less formidable but changed. She regarded him not as prey, not as threat, but as something altogether new. "You have altered the hive," she said, her words heavy with truth. "The galaxy will tremble at this bond. Perhaps it will burn because of it. Yet today, my daughters live. For that, human, you have my gratitude and my warning." Elias shifted, his body aching, but a faint smile tugged at his lips as he looked down at the two small forms nestled against him. His voice was hoarse but steady. "They're just children. And children deserve to be safe." For a long moment, the queen said nothing. Then she turned, her claws clicking against the stone as she strode from the chamber, her warriors falling into step behind her. Elias lay back, the daughters stirring slightly as they burrowed closer, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to close his eyes with something resembling peace. The hive had changed, and so had he. The war was not over, perhaps it had only begun, but in the quiet weight of two lives trusting him without question, Elias found the strength to face whatever came next.